Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last period before your spring break. So I'm sure you guys are excited about that. So we're going to talk about social classes in a minute. I'm just going to give it an extra minute or two for people to log in who are unable to or who maybe got delayed. So we'll give it another minute or so. If you would like to comment, you're able to comment. Welcome comments, questions. And again, I'll be checking my inbox just to see, because I know you need a channel to comment. So if you don't have a channel and you can't comment, you can shoot me an email and I'll check the number in my inbox. That way I can open your email and answer your question if you're unable to comment in the live chat portion. All right, give about another 20 seconds or so. All right, so let's talk about social classes. So your book covers what they would consider four social classes. Now, hey, what's up, Trey? How you doing? Now let's look at this from the typical American perspective and then from your book's perspective, because typically I think the American perspective would be there's upper class, middle class, and lower class, and those would be the three classes that exist in America, and that there are varying degrees among those classes. So you can be on, upper middle class, or you can be lower middle class. You can be, Jeff Bezos in the upper class, or you could just be someone who makes $500,000 a year and be in the upper class. So there are varying degrees there, but we in America would generally we look at it as three classes. Your book would cover four classes, and your book would say that there's the upper class, and they consider the upper class to be the top 1% of wage earners. So that would be generally making, it depends on your state, but generally making, somewhere over $400,000 a year. Some states are in the threes, some states it's a little higher, but generally, mid six figures. Um, Now, I think generally as Americans, when we think of the upper class, we think, somewhere probably in the 200,000, $250,000 plus range. So that would still be that, according to your book, would be considered on the upper end of the upper middle class. And quite frankly, sometimes I think we may think someone who makes just plain old six figures would be in the upper class. So your book would call the top 1% the upper class. Then the next like 45-ish% of Americans would be considered, your book would consider them the middle class. So they would break that down into upper middle class and then middle class and lower middle class. But generally, there's the upper class, middle class, according to your book. Then there's the working class, and that would be anybody who's not in the middle class but isn't like extremely impoverished. And then your book would call the lower class or the underclass the bottom 9% of wage earners. So your book would consider people in the working class on the lower end who are below the poverty line to still not be the low class. And so I think we would differ from that generally. Societally in America, we would consider people at least below the poverty line to be lower class as far as socioeconomic class is concerned. And quite frankly, I think we would lump some of the working class that's not below the poverty line into lower class as well sometimes, just based wage earners. So your book takes a little bit of a different approach than we do. I think societally in America, but I think they're trying to be more forward thinking in your book than current thinking. Your book also points out inequality, that inequality is something that exists because obviously if there's a top 1%, there's a bottom 1%. And the amount of money that the top 1% owns in relation to what the bottom 1% owns is staggeringly different. However, anything that we do to try to solve this inequality um, it's going to cause issues. Anytime we mess with one metric, we oftentimes throw other metrics off, or we cause unintended consequences in other areas. So while inequality is an issue and there are people who are impoverished, people that have need, when we try to address this on a large scale and completely level the playing field, oftentimes we end up creating more issues than we solve, or at least creating new issues. Uh, and sometimes we don't even solve the original issue and we create other problems. But inequality is definitely an issue. However, addressing it has tended to be a challenge, to say the least. Um, okay. Any questions or comments up to this point? I'm just going to pause for a minute for questions or comments. Okay. So now let's talk about class mobility. One of the hallmarks of America's capitalist system is class mobility. You can move up socioeconomic classes or you can move down socioeconomic classes. And since we have a socioeconomic system where your economic status is linked to your social status, if you are able to increase your economic status, you have class mobility. You've moved up a class. So sometimes this is also referred to as social mobility. It's basically the same thing. Um, so class mobility is an important thing because it's part of what would be considered the American dream, right? Of having a better life and having a better life for one's family. Like most people would hope that their children move up the socioeconomic ladder higher than they were, at least one rung. So class mobility is a very important hallmark of the capitalist system because in other systems of economic policy, the idea would be flat equality, and there is no class mobility, or at least there's very, very limited class mobility. There are those who are in the party and those like who are in the governmental party who do governance and actually get a bunch of perks that no one else gets, and then there's everyone else. But in this system, there is mobility, and so someone who is impoverished can move up sometimes all the way up, right? You have like your Andrew Carnegie, who only had a couple $100 in his pocket, and then ends up being a multi millionaire. So class mobility is something that's an important feature, and then also something to point out as far as inequality is concerned that economic or socioeconomic inequality has other implications outside of just plain old economics. One would be education. So for someone looking to go to college, if they're in the top 1%, a $40,000 a year college bill is not a big deal at all. Because if their family is raking in, $500,000 a year, that's less than 10%. That's still a lot of money, but 10% isn't that big of a deal. Whereas if you have someone who's under the poverty line, the annual tuition for a school that is a $40,000 a year school is way more than the family's going to make. It's significantly more than what the family's going to make. So the school bill exceeds the annual income. And so having access to education can be a problem. And that's just for college. Oftentimes in more impoverished areas, even primary and secondary education is more challenging. Um, I'm not saying getting funding because the government oftentimes funds those, but the quality of materials that are given to the school, or even sometimes just challenges of meeting issues. Like it's very hard to learn when you're hungry, right? And so if you have people that come from low income areas that are not being fully nourished and aren't having their calorie requirements being met, it can be very difficult for them to excel. And I'm sure we've all experienced this before when we've been hungry and trying to do something where we have to concentrate, right? Now imagine that's life. And that's just a couple of challenges of education. I'm not saying that's all of them. And then also another challenge is healthcare. If you're making $1 million a year and you need to see a specialist for a serious illness, you can fly to LA, or you can fly from LA to Pittsburgh or LA to New York, and you can pay $20,000 to see the specialist out of pocket if your insurance won't cover it, and you can pay $200,000 for whatever treatment you need. But if you're making $20,000 a year, it's going to cost you your entire year's earnings to see the specialist, and then it's going to cost you 10 times, 10 years earnings to get that $200,000 treatment. And if insurance doesn't cover it, you're having to pay out of pocket. Or even if insurance covers part of it, paying out of pocket can still be an extreme burden for impoverished families. Therefore, people who have lower income oftentimes have poorer health. Now, I'm not saying that it's always because of access to healthcare, because oftentimes obesity rates are much higher in impoverished areas and lower income areas than they are in higher income areas. And part of that has to do with diet choices. So, just in general, there is a direct correlation between low income and poorer health, just like there's a correlation between lower income and issues getting higher levels of education. So, um, while there can be benefits of class stratification, as far as we talked about last time, with individuals who have the most qualifications getting the higher payments for that, or getting more remuneration for that. However, there are negatives, which we just talked about, access to education and poorer health being a couple of them. All right, that is it for today. I do want to pause one last time for questions. Any questions or comments? All right. Well, then, I hope you all have a great Easter break, and we'll get right back into it after break. If you have any questions, email me in the meantime. Have a great day, everybody.